Would you ask Dr. Farrar to come back in, please? Good. Right, Dr. Farrar, all ready to go on, I hope.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you very much. Yes, Ms. Malhotra?
Well, Dr. Farrar, we were talking about the 16th of June. I'd like to move on to when you first attended Rbkc on the 16th of June. Was it the position that you attended with the Secretary of State, the Housing Minister Alok Sharma and Fiona Darby, and you arrived at 9 a.m?
So I attended with the Secretary of State to start with. Alok Sharma and Fiona Darby went, I believe, directly to the council to have a meeting with the housing director.
You state that you were met by Nicholas Paget-Brown in your statement and two councillors, is that right?
Yes, yes, at the Westway Centre.
Is that the first place that you went?
Yes.
You say in your statement, we don't need to go to it unless you'd like me to take you to it, that you were surprised to find that they were unsupported by any senior officers of Rbkc, is that correct?
Yes, I was surprised.
Why were you surprised?
Well, in my experience, and as a former chief executive in local government, I would have expected the leader to be supported by at least a senior official, if not the chief executive. I personally would have seen a visit by the Secretary of State and a Director General from government as significant. I would want to make sure that that I was able to answer any questions that they may have, and there are different roles for politicians and officers, so I would have felt it important to have both represented.
The day before, when arrangements were being made for your attendance, did you request senior officers of Rbkc to attend?
No, I didn't. I assumed they would be there.
Did you request for Mr. Holgate to attend?
I requested a meeting with Mr. Holgate.
What about any other Rbkc officers at the Westway Centre? Did you observe any there?
I didn't. I didn't observe any. There were a number of people there, but Rbkc officers weren't visible as Rbkc officers if they were there.
Would you have expected them to be there?
Yes, and I would have expected them to be visible. So when running rest centres myself previously, my staff would have clearly been marked as council staff and there to support.
How would they be marked as council staff?
They would have either had a lanyard or a jacket with some kind of indication that they were council staff, but it would have been clear that they worked for the council.
And whilst you were there, you say that you spoke to the councillors. Were you reassured by your conversation with them?
No, I was not reassured at all, actually, by my conversation with the councillors.
What did they ask you?
So they asked me questions that I felt should have been. I felt if they had had support of senior officers, these were quite straightforward questions that should have been answered. So not particularly things that the councillors themselves would have known, but they were asking me questions about housing and availability of housing in the area, about schools and about education, and I felt that these were services that the council themselves would provide, and officers could give useful answers to these questions. So that worried me a bit, and for example, I found myself in a conversation with the leader who asked me how we communicate with schools and particularly schools or academies. But I said, well, actually, that would naturally happen through the education department in the council, who would have all contact details, who would contact schools, and that would be the route. They were also asking me about communication and what kind of support that they needed, and and were thinking of bringing in PR support. But my feeling was actually, they needed proper communication support to help communicate with residents. I felt that officers could have given that reassurance and information about where and how to receive support. So I felt that the councillors there at the time were struggling to gain relevant information, but really it seemed very genuine in terms of their real wish to help residents.
So you've mentioned there the visibility of officers, the questions by the councillors. I'd like to ask you about what you observed at the Westway, please.
So I observed a number of things. So first of all, the absence of senior officers or any officers, the questions that I was asked by councillors, which I felt the council would have been able to answer. I noticed the absence of proper bedding, which seemed significant to me just in terms of the way the arrest centre was set up. And I noticed that actually there were people there who seemed to still be staying in the Westway Centre and in fact were not in hotels.
So you observed people sleeping at the Westway?
Well, I think they seemed to me to have been sleeping at the Westway. They weren't asleep at the time.
Can I take you to CLG 3030477, please? And if we go to page 2. And it's the second bullet point. We can see here at the top, 15th of June, 8:45. It's an email that you've been shown earlier today. At the third bullet point, it says, there have also been a couple of concerns raised with him about the quality of the sleeping materials that were available for people last night, and ask if there was anything Her Majesty's Government could do to help the council upgrade. Did you consider it acceptable that these issues that had been raised on the morning of the 15th had still not been resolved by the time of your visit?
So I think, as we discussed earlier, I hadn't, at the time of my visit, I wasn't aware that those issues had been raised earlier. So at the time of my visit, no. I think so from my own experience of setting up rest centres, actually it's done in partnership with the Red Cross or with other providers. In my own experience, actually the bedding is supplied, so there is actual bedding for people to sleep on. I mean, it's so some kind of mattress or something, which didn't seem to be there. The bedding provided is, in experience I've had before, is the same, so it's provided. This seemed to be, the bedding there was all very different, so it looked to me as if it had come from donations. I mean, I may not be right about that, but actually it didn't seem to be the kind of regimented rest centre that I would have been used to setting up. In fact, I only a few years before had set up rest centres in Bath in response to an incident.
Could I just ask you about that? You mentioned the British Red Cross and having an agreement in place for bedding. In your experience, how would that be facilitated? So
in my experience, and it may not be the British Red Cross, but in my experience as a chief executive, my emergency planning department had arrangements with another provider, or in fact sometimes had items in stock, so that when we had to set up a rest centre, it would happen very quickly, and there would be mattresses and there would be bedding, and it would all look very similar, and there would be therefore places for people to sleep.
You've already said that the bedding was of a different nature. Was it your assumption that then this had been provided by donations as opposed to a prearranged agreement between Rbkc and another supplier?
It seemed like that to me, but I mean, I have no evidence of that, but it seemed like that to me. And in fact, there was a table of donations in the Westway Centre, where there was clothing and I believe some bedding.
Did you raise this with anybody whilst you were there?
No, I didn't, actually, because I was raising a number of other issues. So this was just one of my observations, which led to my assumption that actually that there needed to be a proper or a more organised gold response from the council.
You say that there were other issues that you were raising. What other issues?
So the ones that I have mentioned primarily.
Can you help us with how many people there were at the Westway Centre?
So there were a number of people there. They mostly, to me, seemed to be from the voluntary sector. In fact, people we were introduced to or who introduced themselves to us were from the voluntary sector. So some were offering counselling support, for example. So there were a number of people there and a number of tables with people at them. It was the lack of sort of a council contact point that concerned me.
Did you meet with any volunteers at the Westway Centre?
Not properly, but they were introduced to the Secretary of State, I believe, and briefly met one or two volunteers, but didn't have any lengthy conversation with them.
I'd like to move on to a meeting at 9:40 then. This is still on the 16th of June. There was a meeting between the Secretary of State and Nicholas Paget-Brown, the leader, at the Westway Centre at approximately 9:40, you say in your statement. What was discussed at that meeting?
So a number of things were discussed. People who remained at the Westway Centre were discussed. I specifically remember a conversation about, instigated by the leader, actually, about education, the one I mentioned earlier about how to ensure that schools were engaged and informed, which seemed strange to raise at a meeting with the Secretary of State. I also offered at that meeting the leader the housing support that had been offered from the department, and I have to say the leader seemed delighted to take up that offer of support. He also discussed communication support. As I say, I think he was looking for the wrong type of communication support, so I was able to talk to him about that, and so was the Secretary of State, and I believe actually we said that the LGA had offered communication support. Again, he seemed really grateful to accept that. So I was slightly worried that the Office of Support hadn't been being given to the leader. I may be wrong, but he didn't seem to know about all of the offers of support, and as I say, was really grateful to receive the offer of housing support.
Can I just pause you there for one moment? You said wrong type of communication. He was asking for the wrong type. What did you mean by that?
So he was wondering if he needed some support to help with the media, and there were a lot of media there, and felt inexperienced to deal with that. I seem to remember that's the gist of the conversation, and obviously that is something that as a leader you would think about, because they would want to media obviously want to speak to you, but he was asking, what type of communication support could he have, and actually the LGA were offering a wide range of communication support, and including support for residents. I felt, having been through some incidents myself, so for example the incident I mentioned in Bridgend, where there was an international media presence and interest in that, actually we drew in some support from central government, which was really helpful, because it meant that we could separate off the communication support from the actual response, and have different teams who could answer media questions, but more importantly have a team who could support residents. So that kind of knowledge and support, and people who are used to dealing with communications in emergency situations, I felt that would be useful for him as a leader. If you haven't been through this type of situation before, you wouldn't necessarily know that was available, but felt that we could put him in touch with the local government association who were offering support in that area.
Your answers have probably dealt with my next question, but was this visit and was this conversation with the leader reassuring?
No, so it was pivotal actually in terms of my worry about the council and whether they really were managing the situation as they should. And I think a particular worry were residents who were still at the Westway Centre, and I think there were questions by the leader and councillors about the support central government might give in order to provide funding, and actually had we had seen that the Secretary of State had said and was very reassuring that support was available. The leader didn't seem to know about that support, and asked directly, how he could make sure that residents were receiving the housing that they needed. And I was asked to raise this at the meeting with the Director of Housing, who, to find out what the plan was for residents who still had not been housed. So I said that I would do that when I went to the meeting with Alok Sharma.
I'd like to take you to a text message that you sent to Miss Richardson, CLG 3030627. You mentioned there the leader accepting support from housing colleagues, and we can see here council leader has agreed help from housing colleagues in terms of people. Could you link in with housing to arrange who, so that Alok can let them know at his meeting? Thanks. Is this what you're referring to, the offer of support to the housing team at Rbkc?
Yes, and the leader, who's the leader of the council, accepted this. So I felt that as one of the most senior people in the council, I felt that that this should be relayed to that meeting, because he obviously was very happy to have support.
And we can see that message was sent at 10:13. You then go on to send a message. I think they need a specialist emergency manager to help with this, as well as specialist comms support. Not sure they want this, but I think it is essential. Can you give us the background to that message that you sent?
Yes. So, as you know, I'd spoken to Nicholas Holgate about support.
Was that the conversation with Nicholas Holgate the day before?
The day before, and having seen the Westway Centre and putting that together with the confidence of the Chief Executive, I felt that his confidence was probably misplaced, because to me it seemed that having experienced and having managed these situations could be really helpful. And that really came from the questions from councillors, because they were the type of questions that are actually common in emergency situations. So having a reassuring presence who had led these types of situations, I felt would be really helpful. And I also felt that the specialist communications support, as I've said, I learned an awful lot of lessons from managing that incident in Bridgend, and the communication support needed. And as I say, it has to be really wide-ranging. And I'm absolutely sure that the council hadn't recognised that. I wasn't aware of that. So really felt, so for me, the two things they needed was someone who was experienced operating their gold arrangements, and someone helping them with communication, particularly to residents.
I'd like to go next to CLG 3030638. These are text messages between you and Miss Dawes, and I believe your messages are in grey and hers are in blue. Is that right?
Yes, there's also a typo on one of mine. It should be comms.
We'll come to that. It says, great, we'll report back. Personally worried that council are out of their depth. Have said we will give some housing officers. We'll also support out, is that supposed to be comms support with
Yes.
LGA, Jo? And Miss Dawes responds, feel free to make big judgment call if we need to make massive Whitehall offer or demand LGA one. Part of what we need to do is keep leaping ahead of the immediate situation. Yeah. Did you feel able to make a judgment call about what the response needed?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did. And I think if we talk about what happened later, I think I did make a big judgment call. I also had a conversation with Melanie after these text messages. So I felt that I had the support of the Permanent Secretary. The Secretary of State had also given me support. He had similar concerns, obviously having visited the Westway Centre, so I felt I had the support to be able to make an offer or use some sort of soft power to help make sure that the situation was being managed.
Just final message I'd like to take you to, please. CLG 3030647. We can see here in blue, just spoke to number 10, you free to speak, yes, just back with S, we'll call in a Mo. And then there's a message at 1:25, which we can come to in due course. Was this sequence of events that we can see here, just speaking to number 10, is that Miss Dawes telling you that she had spoken to number 10?
Yes.
Did this happen, was this exchange after you had spoken, after you'd attended the meeting with Laura Johnson and spoken with Mr. Holgate and Mr. Barradell?
What time was the message?
Unfortunately, we don't have the time. All we see is that the later messages, all good here, is at 1:25.
So, we had several conversations, so it's just hard to pin that down. So we had one after I left the Westway Centre on the way to the meeting with Alok Sharma, and we had, I believe, another one after I'd met with Nicholas Holgate, and we had a further conversation before the ministerial recovery group. So we had 2 or 3 conversations. I'm not entirely sure which this one was. I think because there's not too much of a gap and it says manager taking over, I presume this was earlier when I was talking about they need an experienced person to take over.
Okay. Well, I want to move on to 11 o'clock that same day. Rbkc's Housing Director, Laura Johnson, Rockfielding Mellon, Alok Sharma, the Minister for Housing and Planning, and Fiona Darby, the Deputy Director for Homelessness, had a meeting, is that right?
That's right. And in fact, I had suggested that the day before that, because the meeting was going to be with Laura Johnson as the Director for Housing, I had suggested to the department that the lead member for housing should also be there. I thought that was appropriate because of the different responsibilities of members and officers and the leadership role of members as well as officers, and given that Alok Sharma was attending along with officials from government, I felt that would be appropriate. So, that was another thing, that something that stuck in my mind really was there seemed to be an awful lot of deference in Kensington and Chelsea from members to officers. So people were addressed by their surnames. So Mr. Holgate, Miss Johnson. For me, that seemed unusual. So one of the things that I was questioning was the amount of challenge that you have between members and officers. So in the councils that I had been chief executive of, actually I was used to and welcomed scrutiny and challenge from members. It ensures that that you have the best results. Now, in an emergency situation, there is a responsibility as the Category 1 responders for officers to take more of a role. So not everything would be done in the same way as in normal council business, but the way the council was run, and really I'm acting on very thin evidence, but the fact that people called each other by their surname, but it just raised an issue for me in terms of what was that relationship like in terms of their other business. That was something that I spotted on the Friday.
And so this meeting had started and you attended after the meeting started, is that right?
I attended towards the end of the meeting.
So you would say you weren't there you weren't present for the whole of it?
Not for the whole meeting. I was there for part of the meeting, so I heard part of the discussion.
Can you tell us what you heard?
So at this point, they were finishing talking about how the council's plans for rehousing, there was a conversation which I also relayed from the leader about MHCLG sending someone to be embedded within their council team. I have to say that wasn't entirely welcomed.
Who was it not welcomed by?
By the Director of Housing.
Is that Laura Johnson?
Yes. So, Laura Johnson, it was quite clear that she was working really hard and had been working very long hours, and maybe this is something that I'll come back to, but had been working really hard to make sure people were housed. But I feel as the Director of Housing, you can't do all of this on your own. So, but she said to me that she knew Lizzie from previously, that Lizzie was very nice, but wasn't entirely sure they needed that support at the moment. But nevertheless, I said the leader had agreed to it, so Lizzie will be coming, and that's great. So,
and we know that's indeed what happened.
And that is indeed what happened.
I'd like to show you an email next. CLG 3030515. It's an email sent at 2:34 that afternoon on Friday, the 16th of June. The first part of it, please. The meeting with housing was managed well, despite it being understandably fraught. Why was it understandably fraught?
Well, I felt that Laura Johnson was seemed tired to me. I'm surmising, but so just from my impression was that she was tired and perhaps a bit defensive. But I felt that ALOC and housing colleagues were very calm and very clear in their messages and kept reiterating the need for support. So I felt that rather than walking away from the meeting without that offer of support being accepted, I felt that they pushed for that and for answers to questions.
We can see that here. It says, ALOC and housing colleagues were very professional, and it is great that we have been able to organise for someone from the housing team to work with the housing directorate at the council. I'd like to just take you to Alok Sharma's witness statement, that's CLG 1309731, page 9, paragraph 34. He says this: "The meeting was a real turning point for me. Though I had concerns following the previous day's Cross-Whitehall meeting, this was the first time I experienced for myself the way in which Rbkc was handling the situation. My overall impression was that the two individuals I spoke with were simply failing to understand the magnitude of the Grenfell Tower incident and the required urgency in the response. From the manner of the conversation, it was clear that the housing director felt irritated. I and my colleagues were there. We were informed that the local rehousing commitment was a distraction." Just pausing there, is that the commitment to rehouse people locally within 3 weeks?
I presume so, but I wasn't involved in that decision or commitment. But I presume that was what was being talked about.
It was also intimated that DCLG was a distraction for them. The housing director stated that she did not mind having housing support from DCLG embedded with the council, but said she did not have time to respond to our offers of help. Would you agree with that explanation given by Alok Sharma?
Yes, that was a very similar impression that I gained from the meeting.
So after these two meetings that you had, one with the leader, one with Laura Johnson, what was your impression of Rbkc and its leadership?
Well, I was concerned. So I was concerned that there wasn't an alignment between the political and the official leadership. I was concerned that the housing director had been trying to manage this on her own. And actually, it seemed to me that she genuinely seemed concerned to me and wanting to do the right thing, but she appeared tired. She mentioned that she had been working for a number of days. I feel that if they had asked for support, particularly from London Resilience, that there would have been a rota which I believe would have allowed the housing director to just look at the situation maybe more strategically, or at least have support. So would have been able to have time to think about other offers of help and support, because there would have been support for her in terms of managing the immediate housing need. And personally, I think it would be, in an incident of this magnitude, really difficult for one person to be leading the housing response when so many people had lost their homes.
You've mentioned London Resilience and the London Resilience Partnership a number of times. Could you just clarify what exactly you're referring to when you say London Resilience would be stepping in?
So I think you, is it...
The London Local Authority Gold, is that what you're referring
yes,
to?
Yes, is it referred to
LLAG?
LAAG is what I'm referring to when I talk about London Resilience.
And just to be clear, that's the London Local Authority Gold?
Yes.
I'd like to go back, please, to the text message we were looking at before, that's CLG 3030627. We can see there at with the second message that you think a specialist emergency manager was required. Melanie agrees, I'm working on this now. This is messages between you and Catherine Richardson. And then you say an experienced ex-chief exec who has dealt with things like this or someone similar would just grip this and would be good. Jo, was it the case that you, Miss Richardson, and Miss Dawes agreed that a specialist emergency planner was necessary?
Well, someone who had experience of managing emergency situations, it seemed to me, needed to be leading local authority gold. I actually think that had Kensington and Chelsea invoked the London Resilience arrangements, London Gold arrangements at the time, then actually that would have brought in a rota. So I think it's probably similar for Nicholas Holgate as it was for the Director of Housing. It's very difficult for someone to manage this intensity of situation as the Gold without other experienced people helping. Had he drawn on that earlier, it might have been that the situation, that they would have managed the situation differently and would have had stronger arrangements moving forward. I think it had reached a point, though, in my mind, where actually they just really needed to draw on someone who was experienced, and they just needed clarity of leadership.
Can we take it from this exchange that you were unaware that Mr. Holgate had been in discussion with Mr. Baradell the day before?
Yes, I was unaware, and in fact, there was no suggestion from my conversation with Nicholas Holgate that he was going to ask Mr. Baradell to give additional help. In fact, he had said to me that they were already helping. So hence, at this point, I'm questioning whether that arrangement is effective and whether they need additional support if this was how the London Resilience arrangements were working. But I was questioning in my mind whether the London Resilience had actually been pulled in or not. So that's something that I was starting to ask, and in fact saw wasn't happening later on.
Just on that point, do you consider that there was any issue with RED's situational awareness then?
So as I say, I think so the role of RED is really to act as that liaison point between the strategic command group. I mean, we're now talking about their local authority response. So they would have been sitting on the strategic command group. That, I mean, the way it should have worked is that information was either being fed through that strategic command group. I mean, that's the way it should work, and partners will be spotting if things aren't working appropriately, and will be feeding. That will be being fed into that meeting, captured in minutes and fed up to central government. So that's and that's where Red would capture it. There's also, given our relationship in the department with local government, there's also the opportunity for people to feed in concerns direct. So I would have expected concerns to have been coming in from the LGA or from other London councils or from London Gold, and in fact some messages, I believe, had started to be fed into the department later on that Thursday.
So do you consider that this is something that Red should have been aware of?
Well, Red weren't. I mean, I think there's a reflection by the department, and we see in the department statement about the role of Red and whether they should be resourced to do things differently. I think the way that they were resourced at the time was really to be a liaison point and therefore attend SCG meetings and feed that information back to government. I mean, they didn't operate in a way that they had any inspection functions of local government response. And so when you look at other organisations such as the Electoral Commission, for example, also very familiar to local government chief executives, not only will they oversee the election process, but they also have an inspection function that goes to different elections to make sure that things are operating properly. I mean, Red certainly weren't resourced in that way to have that inspection function.
Let's move on, please, and you'll have to help us with the sequence of events here. Is it the case that you then, after exchanging these messages, had a meeting with Nicholas Holgate?
So I thought that we had arranged to have a meeting with Nicholas Holgate at that time, and certainly that had been the liaison with his office. When I arrived at the council, I found that he wasn't available to see me. So once I'd finished the meeting with Alok Sharma, I went to the meeting with Nicholas Holgate and found that Nicholas Holgate wasn't available to see me. So I spent some time with the member for housing who happened to be there. We spent some time with him, talked a bit about the council and how it operated. Normally, I asked him about the deference and calling people by their surnames, Mr. Holgate, Ms. Johnson. He said that had always been very normal in the council. So again, it gave me the impression that officers had a strong role in the council, and there was a lot of trust from members in officers, and it wasn't operating in the same way as other councils. I don't blame the members for that, actually. I believe that's the culture of that council. It seemed unusual to me.
You're speaking quite fast. Could I
Sorry.
just ask you to take it slightly slower?
Of course.
Was there a time when you then had a meeting with Mr. Holgate?
Yeah. Yes.
Can you tell us what time roughly that was?
So it would have been before John Barradale took over, so there was confirmation of that at 1:30, so maybe 12:30 to 1 o'clock. I thought I was seeing him about 11:30. I thought I'd arranged to see him, so it was after that time.
When you did eventually then meet with Mr. Holgate, what did you discuss with him?
Well, I mean, it was a strange meeting, in my view. So because people were coming in and out of the office, I found it hard to gain his attention.
Was he in his office or in the back?
He was in his office, which seemed to have been set up as a sort of Gold Command. There seemed to be a link to another office. John Barradale was in and out, I noticed, which so that was happening. So there were then conversations going on with Nicholas Holgate and John Barradale and others while I'm trying to have this meeting. So it was very hard to kind of ascertain what support was needed, but it did show me that actually they just needed some organisation and experience and somebody overseeing the gold arrangements in Rbkc
Yeah, you've mentioned Mr. Baradell was coming in and out and speaking to Mr. Holgate. Was he introduced to you?
Yes,
How was he introduced to you?
as John Baradell from London.
Was any
Gold.
official title given to him?
No.
Did you know why he was there?
So I was told that he was there looking at the arrangements and with the purpose of giving some support to Nicholas Holgate as the council lead.
And was that Mr. Holgate that told you that?
I think it was John Baradell, actually. It was in the middle of these conversations.
So Mr. Baradell told you that he was there to support. What did you think of that?
Well, I thought that actually, I thought they really needed an experienced specialist emergency manager who was going to be able to run the council gold arrangements in a way that I would normally have expected it to be run. I mean, Nicholas Holgate had clearly been working really hard for a number of days. At that point, it became clear that he hadn't had the rota arrangements, the help of other chief executives, and it wasn't clear actually that to me that he had requested help from John Baradell or that John was taking over as local authority gold. It seemed to me that my impression was, and maybe I'm not clear on this point, but my impression was that Nicholas Holgate was retaining the local authority gold and John Baradell was there to support.
What did you think should happen?
So I thought, as I say, that they should have someone such as John Baradell with experience should be taking over as local authority gold with the agreement of the council. I thought that would have seemed sensible. As I said, if London resilience arrangements were invoked a few days before and there'd been a rota system, actually that may have worked. But at this time, you have a chief executive who's been managing the situation, is now tired after 3 days. Things aren't happening as they should be. It felt to me that it would be really beneficial to have a fresh pair of eyes and some experience to run the recovery bit of the operation, which is obviously, given my role, the part that I was particularly concerned to look at.
So what did you do?
So I had a conversation with John Baradell outside.
Was that with him alone?
With him alone, outside of the Nicholas Holgate's office. So we had a conversation, and John agreed with me, actually, that it would be sensible for someone like him to be a gold commander. He then mentioned that if he took over, there'd be a rota system. I questioned that and said, wouldn't it be better to have one person in the lead and then the rota as support, so that there's one point of contact given the magnitude of the situation and consistency? He agreed with that. He said that would need to be agreed with London councils. So I rang John O'Brien.
Who's John O'Brien?
The chief executive of London councils, and we had a conversation about this, and he also agreed. In fact, he said that London councils and London Resilience had spotted that things weren't as they should be, hence John Baradell coming to support Nicholas Holgate, and he agreed that it would be good to have one point of contact to steer the operation. I left it at that. I think at that point I phoned Melanie and Catherine Richardson, possibly, but I know I had phone calls when I went back into the room. The situation had changed, and John Baradell was then leading, taking over as Gold Commander. I felt very relieved about that. I thought that was the right thing in this situation.
Just going back ever so slightly, you mentioned that you've had this conversation with Mr. Baradell and Mr. John O'Brien over the phone. How had you left it with Mr. O'Brien and Mr. Baradell? What was your expectation?
So Mr. Baradell said that I would need to speak to John O'Brien, and John O'Brien said, leave it with me, which I did for half an hour, even less. And as I say, when I came back into the room, things were different, and that was really good news. as far as I was concerned.
And how was it? How was it different, and who told you it was different?
So at that point, then John Barradell with Nicholas Holgate in the room. I believe it was John Barradell. It might have been Nicholas Holgate actually that said John Barradell is taking over as local authority gold, and that Nicholas was going to then help him, support him. So the roles had changed around, so we're going to support him. And by that time, then we heard that there was going to be a Prime Minister chaired meeting at 2:00, and that John would take the lead for local authority gold at that meeting. So all of this I found very reassuring, and in fact I also saw John speaking to someone and talking about the type of support he needed to bring in. So again, also very reassuring.
Was this operating within the LLAG arrangements as you knew them to be, or was there something outside?
No, they were. This looked more normal in terms of the LLAG arrangements. So, whether councils, I presume councils are usually more proactive in asking for support, but very early on in an incident, it seems to be me that the LLAG arrangements in London are operating more on this footing, albeit with a rota basis, not always with a permanently chief executive.
I'd like to take you then, we've been to it before, a text message at CLG 3030647. We can see there at 1:25, you sent a message, I believe this is to Melanie Dawes. All good here now, JB leading Council Gold. I am reassured and I'm currently sorting out his appointment with London Council's Jo. What did you have to arrange with London councils?
So that was the bit about are they happy, which I think was I'm sure was in their remit. Are they happy for one gold commander, albeit with a rota system of support, but that was outside of their usual arrangements. So, there'd have to be some agreement to that, probably with Rbkc. But that's what I was talking to John O'Brien about, and he seemed to think that wasn't an issue. So I believe I had 2 conversations with John O'Brien.
You say that you were sorting out his appointment, and you've explained that you spoke to Mr. O'Brien, that there had to be an agreement. Was that your understanding?
Yes, that was my understanding, and John Barradell certainly told me that in order for that type of arrangement to happen, there had to be an agreement, and the appropriate person to speak to would be John O'Brien. So that's what I did.
After these exchanges and after you had heard what the arrangement was going to be, did your involvement cease that day?
So I stayed for some of the gold meeting, and then I believe I had a phone call. So I can't remember who the phone call was with. I know I spoke to Alex Sharma again that day, but that may have been earlier. And I know I spoke several times to Melanie, but she would have been in that gold meeting. But I had another phone call about the situation, and then that was the end of my involvement. That was the end of my involvement at the council. There were other things that day later on, but
just to finish off with the conversations about Mr. Barradell, CLG 3030626. We can see here a message between you and Catherine Richardson where you say, John just said the red contact, so your usual level, let M know we have spoken and you're arranging. It will be the person on the SCG, I guess. What was that about?
So John Barradell, really usefully, I think, and not generally Red's role, but asked if he could have a permanent Red contact embedded in his team. That wasn't something that we usually did, but I agreed that, and he said that later on, he said that had been exceptionally helpful, and I believe the department has reflected on that.
You mentioned earlier, or indeed, Ms. Dawes sent you a message saying feel free to make a massive Whitehall offer. What was the massive Whitehall offer that you made?
No, so I didn't make a massive Whitehall offer. I think what I felt that Melanie and in fact Sajid Javid as well were saying is that feel free to make a judgment call, and I felt that for me making sure the right leadership was in place and that they then would be very happy to ask what was needed of Whitehall. That seemed to be the most sensible thing for me to do, and that's what I did. And in fact, John then did assess the level of support that they needed from Whitehall, starting off with the red contact. So I agreed that, and then there were several contacts after that with Melanie and others where the support of central government was drawn in. So I think that this change in leadership was really significant.
You mentioned the term soft power earlier. What did you mean by that?
So So I had no formal power, and I really believe I didn't overstep the mark or do anything outside of normal governance. But I feel I had the right conversations, and it encouraged people to do the right thing. And it was probably the quickest way of making sure the right leadership was in place. As we spoke about earlier, it's not always quick to bring in commissioners to take over a council, but the most important thing is you have strong leadership and that you have really clear governance arrangements when you're overseeing this problem and these incidents. And that's something I've learnt both as a chief executive and in central government. And so for me, it was absolutely critical to have those things in place, and that's why I was so reassured when the arrangements changed.
You mentioned there the commissioners, and there was a discussion earlier about it. Did you at any point give consideration to the powers under Section 5 of the Civil Contingencies Act? Is that something that was considered, to your knowledge?
Can you remind me, can I see what that is?
Yes.
So that I don't refer to the wrong thing. Thank you.
Let me take you to CAB 404616. And if we could go to Section 5. Section 5.1, a Minister of the Crown may, by order, require a person or body listed in Part 1 of Schedule 1 to perform a function of that person or body for the purpose of, and in this context it would be taking other action in connection with an emergency, or subsection B, reducing, controlling or mitigating the effects of an emergency. Was any consideration given to the Minister's power under this section?
So there may have been, as I say, there was a structure in place in central government, and it's quite possible that was discussed. I mean, and at that point, the local, I think at that point, the SCG was still being, it was still in the response phase, so was being managed by the police. I think it would have been unusual for a Minister of the Crown to take over that part of the response, I think. And there may have been conversations about the council. I know the concerns about the council were increasing. My concern was to make sure that they had the right leadership in place, which I think then reduced the need for this to take place. I think if the change had not been made, then I imagine that government would have looked or considered taking a different action.
Well, that might have been quite a long-winded way of doing anything, mightn't it? Because I think I'm right in saying that an order under Section 5 has to be made by a statutory instrument subject to the affirmative resolution procedure.
No, that's absolutely right. And so it may have taken, even if it was prioritised and done really quickly, it wouldn't have happened in hours. So it seemed to me that the
Well, it wouldn't have happened in days, would it, under the affirmative resolution procedure?
I think you're absolutely right, Mr. Chairman. And so for me, making sure the right leadership was in place as quickly as possible seemed to be the most important thing, and therefore it seemed important to intervene in the way that I did.
Can you recall if Parliament was sitting at this time?
I can't recall, actually.
I'd like to move on, please, and take you to your witness statement. It's the penultimate paragraph, so CLG 403436. Forgive me, an email. If you could, if we can scroll down to the next page, it should be on page 2. The meeting with housing was managed well, despite it being understandably fraught. This is the message in respect of the meeting with Laura Johnson. You then go on in the next 2 paragraphs. We're putting a person from Red in the response team to support John and act as a link back to central government. Is this the role that Miss McManus then subsequently went to fill?
Yes, yes, I believe so, yes.
And then right at the very end of that email, you say, having been quite concerned this morning about the council's ability to manage a situation of such magnitude, I am much more reassured now that they have the support of John Barradell, who has experience of managing emergency situations. You could see that a proper structure was being put in place. Would you agree that after the 16th of June, your involvement then subsided?
Yes, to a large extent. There were other things that I did after the 16th of June, but this was my main involvement in that week.
You say in your first witness statement, CLG 3030414, at page 22, paragraph 106. In my opinion, Rbkc's response to the fire was inadequate. Do you still stand by that assessment?
Yes.
What was inadequate about it?
So is now in the benefit of all the information I now have, but I believe not drawing in the support of others, particularly the London Gold arrangements, meant that the council struggled to provide the response that it needed. It didn't have other experienced people to help, and therefore was unable to respond, particularly in the first few days, to the size of the incident.
Do you think that DCLG Red operated effectively in the response to the fire?
So I believe that that Red was resourced and to act in a certain way, and I personally saw the efforts of Red and particularly Catherine Richardson and her team, and I know how hard that they worked during that period. I believe they carried out the functions that they were required to do, and I believe they also went above that. But I think the department reflected in its final statement on, whether the role of Red should be different to that. But at that point, they were resourced to be a liaison point between the SCG and central government, and I believe that that's what they did.
Do you consider, given the refusals of support by Mr Holgate on more than one occasion, that intervention by DCLG could have happened sooner?
Well, I think as we've discussed, intervention is actually quite hard. We were just talking about intervention under the Civil Contingencies Act.
Intervention in the sense of the action that you then subsequently took. Do you think that could have happened sooner?
So the action that I personally took,
Yes.
possibly if it's difficult to say, actually. I mean, I'm really pleased that I went there on the Friday and was able to see those things. Would I was therefore able to meet with the leader, other councillors, a number of the middle of the incident on the Wednesday or the Thursday. Would I have seen those things so clearly? I mean, that's something I ask myself. I do think that the value, I think the department has learned something about the value of experience. I think even I, with the experience, hadn't realised how significant that could be, and I think that's something that we have all reflected on.
Well, thank you, Dr. Farrar. Those are the questions I have prepared for you.
Right, so we need to have a break at this point. Dr. Farrar, just so you understand, when Council gets to the end of her questions, we have to have a short break first to let her check that she hasn't left anything out, but also to allow other people who are following the proceedings from elsewhere to suggest questions that perhaps we ought to put to you. So we'll stop now. I think we'll combine it with the afternoon break, shall we?
Yes.
And take a little longer than we might otherwise do for this. We'll come back at 3:15, and at that point we'll see if there are any more questions for you.
Thank you very much.
All right, would you go to the usher then, please? Thank you very much. 3:15 then, please. Thank you. Would you ask Dr. Farrar to come back in, please? All right, Dr. Farrar, we'll see if there are any more questions we need to ask you, shall we?
Thank you.
Yes, Ms. Malhotra.
2 questions, please. We've heard earlier, you said that you were a chief executive and the experience that you received as a result of being a chief executive and responding to emergencies. Can you help us with whether you received training when you were a chief executive on civil contingencies?
Yes, on a number of occasions.
Did you attend EPC, for example, the Emergency Planning College?
I did on one occasion. I also had training by different providers, 2 other occasions at least.
And the final question is there anything else that you would like to add to your evidence that may be relevant to the inquiry's investigation?
I think I'd like to make 2 comments and probably 3 lessons, if that's okay. So, first of all, I'd like to thank the inquiry for inviting me and for allowing me to give evidence. I feel that has been really important, and you have helped me to give my evidence in what I feel has been a very positive way. The second thing, which I wasn't able to mention at the beginning, is just my admiration of the bereaved and survivors of the Grenfell Tower fire. I met a number of them since the incident happened. I've always been so impressed by their bravery and by their commitment to find answers. I've always found them to be very positive and an inspirational group of people to work with. I think my 3 lessons, first of all, we've talked about this, but is the importance of experience. And I'm not sure I realised how important that was until that Friday. I'm glad I've been able to talk about that, and I know the department has reflected on that in terms of its evidence and about building that in to its response. I think the other thing that I'd like to reflect on, the second thing, is the importance of being really clear about roles and responsibilities. So being clear who is the local authority gold, being clear about when and how to bring in support, and being clear through that strategic command group of asking for support when it's necessary. I think the last point I would reflect on is the absolute essential important nature of having a visible presence for people who are impacted by incidents such as this. It's so important for the community to know who to go to and to be able to ask for help and information. I think that will greatly help to reduce distress in what is a really, really difficult situation. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for coming to give your evidence today and for assisting us with our investigation.
Thank you.
And I'd like to add my thanks to you on behalf of the panel. It's been very useful to hear what you have to tell us. We've learnt quite a lot about the events of those few days after the fire, which I think we were unclear about. So you've really added to our store of knowledge, and it's been very interesting to hear what you have to tell us generally. So thank you very much indeed for coming and giving us your time.
Thank you. Thank you all very much.
And you're now free to go, of course.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Ms. Malhotra, we don't have another witness today, is that right?
No, we don't, but we do tomorrow.
But we have one tomorrow morning. So we'll stop at that point for today and we'll resume at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. Thank you very much. 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, please.